This week on Partner Spotlight, we speak with Dr. Patrick Mendis. Dr. Mendis is a Rajawali Senior Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University. Dr. Mendis is also the acclaimed author of A Peaceful War and is a visiting fellow of the Peking University School of International Studies. Welcome to Partner Spotlight, Professor Mendis. Now, just to get things moving along, Sri Lanka and China have been a long relationship over number of years. Why is Sri Lanka so important to China?
That's a very good question. US Sri Lankan Chinese relationship goes back to many centuries. When the Buddhism was the center of learning, Chinese emissaries came to Sri Lanka, especially Faxian, then Xuan Zan during the Tang dynasty. Ever since, Chinese interest in Sri Lanka continued. And in the modern day, what you see is that continuation is going on. So when you look at it, the Buddhism is the attraction to Sri Lanka. And from there on, in the Ming dynasty, Admiral Chong He also visited Sri Lanka 3 times. And ever since, there are legendary Marco Polo visited, and then post-independent time, Sri Lanka has Rice Rubber Agreement, and now we had 8 years of good relationship with Sri Lanka with the massive investment projects both in Hambantota and Colombo Port City. And a number of other infrastructure development in the country to support President Xi Jinping's maritime Silk Road strategy, the southern strategy, which they called 21st century maritime Silk Road, which is the southern route that developed through the Ming dynasty. So that is what is happening in a historical sense. We are looking at the future because President Xi wants to have a rejuvenation of the Chinese culture and what they call the Chinese dream. This is one of the major strategy that China is using, but Sri Lanka is the center, is the jewel or the pearl of this, what we call the string of pearl strategy in the West. So therefore, this is economic development issue, it is progress, and also the looking back the past to project the future, the Chinese influence in the region.
Right. So now Chinese investment in Sri Lanka. You just mentioned that. Now, what are the pros and cons of the type of investment that they're bringing to the country?
Because the China historically has many challenges during the colonial period and the Japanese invasion in China, and China is now the rising power, emerging power in the world. So they have over 1.4 billion people, which they brought these people into the middle class within the one generation. Now more than 600 million people are in the middle class. So right now they have another portion of the Chinese population wanted to keep that development and decrease the poverty and bring progress to the country. So therefore now China has to look global. So this is that part of a strategy that Sri Lanka, because of the historical links, Sri Lanka continue to play a major role. In terms of the investment, Sri Lanka need this kind of investment where the West is reluctant or lagging behind to provide to Sri Lanka since independent. If you look at it, the Sri Lanka Chinese investment, it is over $10 billion last 10 years or so time. But that 10 billion time period is similar to what the US has provided last 40 years or so. So you can see the influence of the monetary power or the economic power in the region. So China is a rising power, then Sri Lanka happened to be the center of this dynamics.
The whole relationship between Sri Lanka and the Western Bloc and India and all that, Are they being more very supportive towards us? Is it just to keep China at bay in the region, or what is it? What is the reasoning behind that?
Reasoning behind
Why the West is so getting involved in Sri Lanka?
You know, Sri Lanka is the center of the world itself, because the Portuguese, Dutch, and British came, and the Arab traders came. Sri Lanka is the not the size what matters. Geographic location, strategic location matters. And also that attraction Sri Lanka has is because of the traditional sense. We have high culture, we have high literacy rate, and well-educated people, and they are highly cultured. So therefore, there is a natural tendency for even the West to come to Sri Lanka throughout the centuries. Now, this is accelerating that process because of the rise in China, putting major emphasis on Sri Lanka and their maritime Silk Road strategy. And there is a tremendous tension because of the geopolitics in the region. One is the traditionally India is not getting along with China. That is, but their relationship are getting better, because in the economic and trade and investment and cross-border issues are kind of leveling off, and there are mechanisms to prevent those kind of things. So in the US also wanted to have this is economic development strategy, because that's what the American founding fathers was looking at. World is integrated through trade and investment and commerce. So China is pretty much using the same kind of strategy, which is in parallel with the American strategy. So there is no any kind of competition, but the political ideology have some kind of tendency to conflict each other, because in the traditional sense. But when you look at the economic strategy or the trade strategies, both countries are agreeing on one. That is why what we have, Sino-American relationship is so strong. And they are trying to avoid any conflict they might have or potentially have it in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean. They are collaborating many fronts. We know now they are trying to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty, and they at the same time they have a Silk Road, and America is also pushing forward the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. So what we are seeing is that the economic and trade and investment is the centerpiece of this one. The politics is at bay right now, because that nominally communist China is using the capitalistic mechanism to get the poverty out of their people. So they experimented when demise of the Mao Zedong and Chu Enlai, and then Deng Xiaoping came into power. He took a different path. So that is under President Xi Jinping, he is continued to see the benefit of the economic liberalization, trade liberalization. You can see that that parallel is going. That is why that the US-China relationship is so strong. This is also the founding fathers' vision. If you look at the Alexander Hamilton, who wants to have a strong trade and a strong connection to the rest of the world. Even other founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington said, trade with all, entangle with none. China is pretty much doing the same strategy, trade with all, entangle with none. So when you look at in a philosophical or historical sense, both China and America is using the same kind of strategy, bring the people together, bring the global community together. In that sense, Sri Lanka can play a great role, the same as that Singapore is playing.
Right. So now let's move on to diplomacy. So in terms of our relationship with China, what do you think that Sri Lanka is doing wrong?
Well, you see the previous administration is putting completely on one side our diplomacy is pretty much focused on China. I mean, I can understand that one because of during the war, Sri Lankan government asked for Indian help, Western help, American help, but finally China came forward, and then completely that war was over in 2009. So ever since, you can see this is the link toward China, leaning toward China was very strong. But now the new administration wanted to have this is a non-aligned or balanced approach to Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka cannot take one part or the other. If you look at the Singapore foreign policy, you can see that they are also working with the Chinese government. Investment and trade and bilateral investment going both sides is very strong. At the same time, Singaporean government cordially and friendship is continuing with the Americans. So there is no conflict over there. It is a matter of how to manage in it. And Singapore also have to deal with Malaysia. So when you look at it, Sri Lanka is in that sense is a blessed nation, is a very self-sustaining, very resourceful nation with a highly educated workforce and very dynamic economic forces or democratic forces at work. As long as there is a freedom and liberty prevail in the system, I think Sri Lankan politics is very dynamic. And Sri Lanka can do greater things than Singapore, working with both the Chinese, both the American, and having a good relationship with our neighbor, India. So it is the matter of right understanding in the historical sense what Sri Lanka can do a major role creating a peace in the region by working with all of them. But the bottom line is, we also wanted to have a trade and investment. If there is the Chinese investment is there, welcome them. If there are American investment and trade in Sri Lanka, welcome them. In the Indian trade and investment, welcome them. It is ultimately what we need is everybody wants to have a good life. You wanted to have your children to have a better life. We wanted to create a more progressive country. We wanted to get rid of this poverty, the suffering, the diseases we have. So, for example, that current president Maithripala Sirisena got a kidney hospital for his home district of Polonnaruwa. And you can see there is that kind of disease is prevailing in Sri Lanka. And can we address that issue? Whether it is a Chinese money, Indian money or Sri Lankan money, it doesn't matter. It is a health issue. Being former health minister, he understands, because he comes from that region, he understands the needs of the community. So whether it is who is giving the solution to that one, you need to welcome them, try to address, need to think about Sri Lanka's population, because that is the most important thing. And Sri Lanka in the other sense also have this is a philosophical reservoir of knowledge, which I call a Buddhism, which also work with the other religious groups in the country, which is a multiracial, multilingual, religious society, which can be a model for the world. So I think I am very hopeful if Sri Lankan leaders are having to have this kind of approach, Sri Lanka can be a great model to the rest of the world to follow.
Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Mendis.